Welcome to Civil War Digital Digest. I'm Will. We're thrilled to bring you another episode where we look at a grouping from a soldier and get to know him a little bit. And we say thanks to Mike Fahle for bringing him in. We also say thanks to two groups. First, the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums for hosting us here. And to get us and the crew here, we say thanks to our patrons, the CWDD Coffee Grinders. They each give a little bit of money each month, and that groups up, and we're able to travel and hire crew as a result. So thanks to them. Let's turn into it. Mike, who are we going to meet today?
Well, we're going to talk about Lieutenant Colonel Charles Skillen of the 14th New York, not to be confused with the 14th Brooklyn.
Well, let's just stop there because a lot of us know the Red Legs from Antietam and other battles. Obviously, the 14th Brooklyn is a storied unit.
Yep.
If this is the 14th New York and Brooklyn's in New York, what gives?
So this regiment was based around like the Oneida and Rome area, and it was the 14th New York Infantry. 2-year regiment, and about Charles Skillen, he was actually born in 1813. There isn't a whole lot known about him pre-war other than that he was a Mexican War veteran, but checking the records, there's not a lot about him of what he was involved in during the Mexican War other than that he was a Mexican War veteran. We know that just before the war, he's 41 years old when he enlists and is commissioned as a captain, and he was a crockery merchant. That's about all we know. There's not a lot about him other than once he starts his military service.
So, okay, and this is Civil War Digital Digest, so let's start the Civil War
so
service.
he starts out as a captain, but doesn't spend much time there, as he is quickly promoted to, I would imagine, probably elected the major of the regiment on the 10th of May, 1861, but he only spends 10 days as a major until he is then elected lieutenant colonel of the regiment on May 20th of 1861.
And we've talked in another episode about the Smith contract boards. If there was ever a person who needed the replaceable boards that Smith's contract gave you, 10 days in a rank and then the next rank, this is it.
That is correct. So he serves with the regiment. Of course, you know, they spend that summer, they are involved in the Bull Run battle. They spend, obviously, winter in D.C. and then are heavily involved in the Peninsula campaign. He is mentioned in reports being outside of Yorktown. He also writes back home and has some published things in the home newspaper about their experiences at Yorktown. They move up through the peninsula, and then his story really begins and then ends, unfortunately, at Gaines Mill.
Okay, so we're at Gaines Mill, and if you say it ends, we're meeting a man who was killed in action.
That's correct. So being part of the 5th Corps, Skillen's 14th New York was right there at Boatswain Creek. It was in Griffin's brigade. They were right in the thick of the fight. Shortly after noon, when you read the Griffin's report, and then also letters home from enlisted men of the regiment that are published in newspapers, state that shortly after noon is when they received their heavy attack. Griffin specifically states that the 14th in itself was under heavy fire. The Confederates are pushing. The 14th is involved in a counter-assault, a bayonet charge, where Skillen is reported that he receives a severe wound. He is then taken on a litter made by blankets and muskets back to the ambulance train and unfortunately perishes en route to the ambulances.
That's, as happens in warfare, hard to hear.
Yep.
We also know from Griffin's report that he was reported to be leading the right wing of the regiment.
That is correct, yeah. So one could envision when we get to the coat and talk about the damage to it is that he was probably had his sword extended when we get down to the forensics of it. But to finish the story of Gaines Mill, once he's perished to the ambulances, his body is then taken to White's Landing, where it is embalmed. You would imagine that the clothing that he was wearing was probably laundered at that time, and it was sent home to Rome for burial.
So he was not sent home in this uniform, of course, because we have it here.
That is correct.
And White's Landing is, of course, the Federal Supply Depot, which was where they could get boats in.
That's correct, yes.
Excellent. So, and I know that looking at the 14th's history, this is the battle they take the most casualties of in their 2 years in the fight.
They were very heavily engaged there.
And unfortunately, Skillen is one of them.
That is correct.
Well, as his service comes to an end there, we are fortunate enough to have pieces of his world, as little as we know about him before the war. We have pieces of his service here. Let's talk about what you have.
Okay, so what we're looking at is his uniform coat, a vest, trousers, his sash, and a beautiful New York State belt. These belt plates, they themselves are not all that unique, but one that still has the silver wash on it is, and we can get that to that in a moment. The story of this grouping actually has kind of an odd history to it. There was a cloth collector who on Halloween night answered his door to a knock, opened up the door, and lo and behold, there is a teenager wearing this jacket.
Excuse me?
Yeah, as odd as it seems. So it immediately piqued his interest. He knew the child was from the neighborhood, and he asked if he could stop over at the family's house after the night was over. So he did make contact with the family, went over there, and then they were actually the ancestors of Charles Skillen. And they had the other associated items that went with the coat that the individual was wearing for Halloween, shockingly enough.
This might be the single most wild how I found
Exactly.
an original
Yes.
story that I have heard in my years around Civil War history.
You know, the irony is there's a lot of ways for things that, you know, come out of the weeds, been in grandma's attic or someplace unknown. But Halloween, yeah, that's quite an unusual way to discover it.
Okay, so the collector in question gets this grouping. Where does it go and how does it get through into you?
Well, it eventually moves on to Shiloh Relics, where it is then sold to a board member of the Old Museum of the Confederacy. Living in England at the time, the uniform goes to England. His wife, who happens to be going to school at the time and her specialty is textile conservation, takes the jacket in because it did have a significant amount of damage to the right sleeve. And all we hear from the records as far as Griffin and other these contemporary published reports of him being, you know, killed in action was that he was leading the charge. It doesn't specifically say where he's wounded, all the contemporary reports.
Talk to me about what testing was done on the jacket.
So the jacket was taken into a university in England where they did testing on the jacket itself in the area where the damaged sleeve occurred, and it had significant traces of human blood in not only the sleeve but the lining also.
Great. Well, before we talk about the jacket, which is a federal senior officer's frock coat with a few flourishes, talk to me about where the damage is because I don't see much from here.
Okay, so when the jacket was originally found, it still had the significant damage that was undone. Unfortunately, in its collecting history, the last collector who had it decided that it would probably sell better with the damage fixed, and they did have it conserved. Then you can see that there's also repaired damage here where probably by looking at it, it's definitely not ball struck. I have a jacket that was struck by a mini ball that it clearly is not like this. I envision that it was probably 2 to 3 pieces of shell that struck him from left going to right in the forearm and then the exit wound out the back. There are pictures in existence that it shows the original coat prior to that unfortunate conservation done. I'm kind of torn about it. I have other bullet struck clothing that I do not repair the bullet holes. I have seen things where bullet struck items have been repaired. There is some validity to it because this jacket, he obviously went out of his way to spend extra money because it had a fine silk lining. Blood is very caustic to material. Definitely the silk, even the wool. So I could see maybe to stabilize the area and from it losing more, you could conserve it. I wish it wasn't that way. However, it doesn't necessarily change the significance of the coat.
Sure, and when you talk about a finer grade of jacket where more was invested in it, looking at the collar, which sometimes is stand up with the velvet on the underside simply to allow the garments to rub smoother together. Here it's been replaced with a turn-down collar with the velvet that shows.
Yeah, if you notice that rather than the black, it has this nice, really deep iridescent blue.
Beautiful.
So he definitely went out of the way. The very rich shoulder boards, the interior of the coat, very finely done. He clearly had at least a reasonable budget to have a lot of those extra features. As we both know that officers had to pay for and equip themselves, so some of them did it economically, other ones would certainly, want to fancy themselves up depending upon how much money they would want to spend. So he certainly went out of the way on features of the coat. Functional cuffs, tail pockets are pretty standard.
Great, and let's talk about the other pieces here.
So we have his sash, and like I said, his belt. There is a photo of him wearing a New York State belt just like this, and it kind of makes me wonder if that's the exact one. The jacket's different because it's an epauletted jacket, but it does have the New York State, the NY with the wreath, still has the silver wash, beautifully done. His vest, really nice, high quality. It does have a stiffener down the back seam that you'll be able to take a closer look at, that it kind of saves from where, you know, if you're moving around a lot, saving that seam and taking some stress off of it. Trousers are finely done, mule ear. They have all the nice trimming, some elaborate scallop work in the stitching around the mule ear, buttons, has some trimming around the watch pocket.
That's fantastic. I haven't seen that very much
No,
before.
I haven't either.
That's an
Yes,
interesting detail.
Yes, definitely extra. The belt in the back is nothing special, but the trouser cuffs then also have buttons on the interior, either for drawers or maybe stirrups to keep your pants down when you're in the saddle to go out and around under the boot.
Absolutely. Anything notable about the sash other than it's a line officer's sash?
No, nothing other than that. Really good shape. The whole grouping is in great shape because, once again, it would have had a very short service time. You know, you wouldn't imagine much wear being done in camp throughout winter of 61, spring of 61. Been on the peninsula, but then this would have been the coat that he was unfortunately killed in, and then have probably laundered and sent back with the body when it was sent back to Rome, New York.
Okay. Well, as I've asked you, as we've looked around other pieces of your collection, you look for identified pieces. You get time to sit and be with these men in a way.
Yep.
This man gave everything for our country. What are you left thinking of when you think about Skillen?
When I think about it is that he clearly gave his life to save the Republic. And the unfortunateness and how much little we know about him, how much is lost. His widow did, of course, apply for pension and, you know, get a widow's pension after the war, but the records are very nil leading up to that time. Although if you read the excerpts from the men in these letters written home that get published in newspapers, they always talk about how highly thought of the lieutenant colonel was. And so it's a work in progress. I hope to learn more about him. I am kind of believing that there's other stuff out there too, yet to be found, that are out in the weeds, and maybe one day on a Halloween it'll knock on my door, right? Probably not, but I would say that it's someone who should be remembered, even if it's just for that one terrible day that he gave all to save the Republic and set other men free. So.
Great. Well, Mike, thanks for caretaking and for conserving, and thanks for sharing the stories with us, because these could go to your closet or your war room and never get seen out of, but you choose to come here to the Hayes Presidential Library and Museums, and actually you helped make the contact here so we could shoot here, and we get to meet this man. Yeah, well, I'm humbled, and always, you know, you get this to share it. It's humbling experience to be able to tell other men's stories and enrich our country's history. Absolutely. Well, it's sharing stories like that that help you forge a greater connection to our American Civil War history. This is something you can take a piece of, take a look at, draw your own conclusions, but remember a man who gave everything for the United States of America. Thanks for spending your time with Civil War Digital Digest. We'll see you next time.